In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Jeanette.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
It's my pleasure to sit down and have this oral historical interview with you. So, for the purposes of the record, we're creating an oral history, which is basically we're having a conversation about your recollections of Atlanta and civic life in Atlanta, Muslim history, your journey to Islam, and any information you'd like to share with me to kind of help create a historical document.
Okay.
So, I'm Zainab Ansari. I'm sitting with Sister Jeanette Nu'man, and we are at Masjid al-Mu'minun in Atlanta, and the date is March 23rd, 2014.
Okay.
So, inshallah, to start us off, could you please tell me about where you were born and a little bit about your family background?
Okay. I was born in Columbus, Georgia. The entire family was affiliated with the military. We have a long family history of being a part of the military. My father and my stepfather were both in the service. My mother worked for the Army. And we didn't have a lot of family in Columbus. My mother's family comes from Shiloh, Georgia, and some of them migrated. My mother actually ended up in Columbus because her mother, she moved to Columbus with her aunt. And so it was just my mother and her aunt and uncle and mother. And then a couple of aunts from my father's side settled in Columbus.
So, now Shiloh, is that in South Georgia?
It's in middle, kind of Midwest Georgia. It's Harris County, which is around, where LaGrange is?
Right.
It's near LaGrange. It's in that vicinity.
And would you feel comfortable sharing your date of birth?
I was born March 2nd, 1951.
In Columbus.
In Columbus, Georgia.
Columbus, Georgia.
Yes.
What was life like in Columbus, Georgia for African Americans in the 1950s?
It was interesting because some of the people that I grew up with, we lived in almost an insulated, very protected community. And we grew up, for the most part, during an era of segregation. I have come in my mouth. And we were located outside of a military base. So you had this juxtaposition of an integrated base and then a segregated neighborhood. So we lived in, it was like the first subdivision that was created for African Americans right outside of the military base. And the community, this was in the late 50s. So the communities then were very heterogeneous. You didn't have kind of the class separation in the community that you have now. So you had the postman, you had the maid, you had the attorney, you had the physician, you had the teachers, the civil service people, the Army people. We all lived in the same neighborhood because where we lived was limited. And so this was the new up-and-coming neighborhood, so that's where everybody clustered. And education beyond high school was an assumption. It was just kind of a given. You grew up thinking that you were going to go to university when you finished high school. Or you were going to go to the Army when you finished high school, and then you were going to go to university when you finished the Army. So, those kind of were the unspoken messages. And the entire community, all of the adults in the community took responsibility for raising the children in the community. So when you walked away from your mother's house, you were under the purview of anybody who happened to be around. And they could discipline you, they could correct you, and they did. And so it was such that whatever happened at school, like if you got in trouble at school that day, when you got to Mrs. Birmingham's house, she knew about it and she scolded you about it. And then, your mother was waiting for you at the end of the driveway when you got home. So that was a different experience. And I didn't realize it was a different experience until I went away to college and found that most people didn't grow up that way. But I think it was a very nurturing environment. I was part of the desegregation of the high school that I attended. One of the parents, Lockett, Jim, Jerry, Gwen Lockett, their mother, she was actually their stepmother. Their mother had deceased. Their father was in the service. And they lived in the second neighborhood, which was Washington Heights. After kind of Willis Plaza got full, then they built Washington Heights, and then they built other communities after that. But after they were stationed in Fort Benning, the way Columbus was situated, there was an elementary school on the base, and there was a partial middle school on the base. We called it junior high school then, but there was no high school. And so the children who lived on the base would go to elementary and middle and junior high school on the base, and then be bused to the segregated schools in the city. So they may pass several high schools driving from Fort Benning to get to the high school that they were to attend. So Mrs. Lockett wasn't pleased with that. So while we were in junior high school, she filed a suit. She sued Muskogee County. And they set up a kind of pilot program at the end of my 8th grade year. And so I ended up being one of 100 students that attended Baker High School, which was the high school that was closest to the military base, and it was also closest to my house because we lived right outside of Sand Hill. So that was an interesting experience. It was a difficult experience.
Desegregating the high school?
Desegregating the high school was difficult because we felt, those of us who went to Baker really felt like we lost something by not going to the black high schools, a kind of a sense of belonging. We had to deal with overt racism among the teachers and among the students, lots of racial slurs, even threats, so it was not an easy thing to do. And, we were children. We weren't quite sure, like, why did I have to be the one to come and do this,
Was that the beginning of your consciousness of there being problems associated with race?
No, I was very conscious of that from a very early age. I was very conscious of the segregated bathrooms at the farmer's market. Santa and I had a little tussle when I was about 3, and so that sort of ended my illusion of Santa. I had some experiences. We lived, there was a white neighborhood and a black neighborhood, and they were side by side. And they were separated by a patch of grass, like maybe from here to here. But, you had to go through there to get to the bus. So, and they were the military kids. So, the black military kids lived in Willis Plaza, and the white military kids lived across the grass. So, no, it wasn't the first.
And so when you would walk through there to get to school from the black side of the grass, were there times that one might experience harassment or anything?
No, we never did, because these were military kids. Okay. And it wasn't so much the harassment. What I saw as real harassment wasn't until I was actually in high school. Okay. I did have an experience with my mother, and I think I was maybe in elementary school, and she had a white colleague, and they wanted to go to dinner. Mm-hmm. And there was a fish restaurant, a seafood restaurant near where we lived. So we went to the restaurant, and when we got into the restaurant, we were stopped at the door. And the manager, waitress, whomever, came and said, "We don't serve colored people here." And so the two of them just decided they weren't going to leave.
And this is what year, roughly?
This was, let me see. I turned 10 in 1961. This was like maybe 62, somewhere between 1960 and 1960. It was before I went to high school. I'm thinking I was in elementary school, so it was maybe closer to 1960.
So Jim Crow is still legal.
Yeah, very much so. And
Actually, it had been ruled illegal by the Supreme Court.
But it was
by
still
then,
practiced.
But it was still very much
it was still practiced, you know, because these were private business owners. They could do what they wanted. And so they took a stand. It got to be very uncomfortable. There was some banter back and forth. And we had dinner. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
You mentioned something being lost with the desegregation.
Yes.
Would you say that blacks before integration, in your experience, were more self-sufficient and confident in themselves?
I think confident I'm not self-sufficient. I can't really say that I would have thought about that as an adolescent.
Okay. I hear a lot about black-owned businesses, infrastructure.
Right. In terms of when you look at it from a holistic perspective, yes, you know, because we did lose a lot of that when the communities were combined. And I think as a people, we weren't prepared for the implications of that, and we weren't prepared for kind of the difference in the way you have to do business in order to survive. Because our way of doing business was very familial. You know, it didn't necessarily follow your business rules. And, you know, for the most part, most of our businesses kind of grew organically. And so there really was not a lot of knowledge of the business rules. And so, you know, we lost out.
So integration became, in many ways, more alienating?
For us,
Yeah.
you know, we felt as though we lost status. We lost recognition, you know, because keep in mind, we grew up in the neighborhood where our teachers lived. And so we knew them, we knew their children, we grew up with their children. These were people who were familiar to us. And so now we were in a place with people who were very unfamiliar to us and judged us very differently. And I'll give you an example. When I was in second grade, I cannot sing. I've never been able to sing in my life, even though I was in a girl group when I was in high school. But I couldn't sing. And I was trying out for the school chorus. And I always had a really, really heavy voice. That's the only way I made it, I believe. But I sang, I had been practicing this song on my little electric piano that I got one Christmas. My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. It was probably the only song I knew. And that's what I sang. And I just happened to be sitting near the judges, you know, as they were going over the different students. And she had been my second grade teacher, Mrs. Harris, and she said, they got to Jeanette. And she said, well, she can't sing, but she's extremely bright and she reads well. So that kind of, so I made the chorus, you know, which was an esteem booster for me. I got to be part of the school chorus. How cool is that, you know, when you're 7? So we lost that kind of connection. And so I think we were judged very differently. I mean, we were all called into the assembly, you know, to have a discussion. You know, there's an assembly. They call your name over the intercom, and you get to the auditorium, and it's just the black students in the school. And so, you know, we have somebody talking to us about how to get along with white people. I mean, really? Really? You know, half of the kids here are military kids, and you want to talk to us about how to get along with white people? You know, and you know, my counselor, you know, even better, you know, because Sandra Lewis, who was Phi Beta Kappa, her counselor told her that she was not college material. They told all of us we weren't college material. And if we thought we might want to go to college, we might want to consider a state school or, you know, community college. Heaven forbid we go to a liberal arts school. So, you know, it was that kind of, that's what we lost. You know, we lost somebody to nurture us and somebody to help build our confidence. It was like a constant battle of I am good enough. And we had to do that at 14 and 15 and 16, without any assistance from anybody that you interface with for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week.
So you take that, and when it's time to,
We had like a full ride. Nobody was going to a white school. Only those that had full rides went to white school. The rest of us were seeking out HBCUs like you couldn't believe.
to get that thing that you lost
To
in high
get
school.
what we lost, to be around somebody who valued us, just like you are a valuable human being. You're not like some alien that just crawled up from under a rock, like I believe in you. And just not to be around these people anymore.
And where did you go?
I went to A&T, North Carolina.
And so you start your college journey with this as your high school experience.
Yes. I was angry by then.
Okay.
I left high school very angry. I wasn't angry before. I was conscious of racism, but I wasn't angry. By the time I got to college, I was angry. And I think I went to A&T because they were fighting there the year before. Like, I'm going to join the fight. I think that was one of the criteria that I used to decide which university I was going to.
And this is the mid-'60s now.
This is the late 60s. This is
Late
1969.
So Malcolm has been assassinated.
Yes.
Martin has been assassinated.
Yes. I was sitting in the classroom when that happened, yes.
And the Nation of Islam is very visible
Yes.
on television. And
But I think I was very aware of Malcolm,
okay.
but not of the nation.
Not of the nation. Okay.
I wanted to ask you, were there any Muslims in Columbus, Georgia?
No. No. And I discovered later, after I became Muslim, that Columbus was very hostile to people in the nation. Brother Sabir and I. Sabir was one of those people who went to Columbus to try to talk to people. Columbus is a different kind of place, because it's very dependent on the military. And people really just don't want to rock the boat. They just want to do what they do and, just leave them alone. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yes.
I want to go back to Dr. King's assassination.
Yes.
Was that a...
I knew, I can see me in the classroom. I was sitting like maybe 3 rows from the back. I was in government class, and I was up against the wall, this wall over here, and it was announced, and I was stunned. I was just stunned. And I didn't know how to process it. And then a group of us, when the bell rang and the class changed, we gathered, which is what we would do. We were those few black students who were at the school. We would gather. We would gather in the cafeteria. We would gather after, in between classes. We were just so grateful to have each other. So I think we developed a closeness that perhaps we would not have had if we didn't if we weren't in that school.
Right.
So we kind of gathered in the hall, and I remember Jim and Harriet and a couple of other people. And Harriet was perhaps the most tearful. And I think part of the reason that Harriet was the most tearful was because of all of our group, she was the most politically astute. For us, it was, because I was in my 8th grade class when President Kennedy was shot. And the teachers were all tearful, and kind of emotionally, there was like a disconnect because I didn't quite understand it. In fact, when they said assassinated, I had to go find my dictionary and look up assassinated, and we were kind of whispering in the back of the room, well, does assassinated mean that somebody's really dead, or does it mean that they're dead, So it was that kind of experience. So then when Dr. King was shot, it was like, oh my God, what's really going on here? Now keep in mind, we are military kids. You know what we know? We know guns. We know guns, we know war, we know shooting. We grow up listening to shooting because when men are not at war, when we were coming up, they practiced being at war. So, 24/7, it's guns. Mm-hmm. Guns and cannons going off, airplanes going over. So, and then I grew up also in the, what was it called, where you had to store your water, the Cold War, the threat of attack. So that's where we go with it. except for Harriet, who was not a military child. Her father was very much involved in politics. We kind of gathered at her house because we loved to engage in dialogue with her father. Our parents, on the other hand, were more pro-U.S., so we gravitated toward him. Because, keep in mind, we're at the school, people don't like us, we don't like that school. So very covertly, we go to Harriet's house. So Harriet was the one who understood the political implications of it much more so than we did. And it was very upsetting. It was very upsetting. And I think that kind of fueled the anger, that I had by the time I graduated from high school. By the time I got to my senior year, I was so angry. I had my own little private protest. Like I would go to class and I would sit in the front seat and lay my head on the desk, just to say, I hate you. And I don't think you're valid, And the teachers were all confused. They didn't get it. But I felt good about it. And then I would just not go to school. Some days I would just not go to school. And, I remember a teacher saying to me, well, Jeanette, you're such a smart school child. Why are you throwing away your future? And I gave her some angry response. I don't remember. But it was angry and most likely rude.
So what did you do with that anger when you got to college as you're choosing what I'm going to do in college, in class and out of class?
Well, I think I chose to try to direct it. Mm-hmm. I got very involved in the Pan-African movement.
Okay.
I worked with the Black Panthers had like a free lunch program on campus. I gravitated toward children, and I really sort of started that gravitation when I was in my senior year of high school. I ended up only going to class half day by the time I got to, my protest actually started my junior year. I settled down my senior year. My junior year was my turbulent year. My senior year was my settled down year. I had finished all of my coursework. I only had 2 classes that I had to take, and that was senior English and I think government. And so I spent the other half of my day at a middle school in close to my neighborhood. And so I began to think, what did we need to do for the next generation? And that sort of became my orientation moving forward in my life. So it was really taking care of the children and taking care of the children in the neighborhood and being a part of those efforts. Now, there were also some Pan-African activities that I was involved in that really didn't have anything to do with children and may be considered not quite legal, but, we thought those things were necessary.
Can you talk about the role of women? So the group that you're involved with. So the Black. I know you mentioned you were involved with the Black Panthers. So what was that the Pan-African group, or were there other organizations? And what were women doing in these groups?
There were actually other organizations. The Black Panthers had just established this free breakfast program. They weren't really very visible on Auntie's campus. They just had this breakfast program. And so there were volunteers from the school that ran the program, to make sure that the children were fed. And we do little workshops, about, and I guess the workshops would now be defined as nationalism. It was really talking to the kids about the beauty of being Black, how wonderful it was to be Black, and kind of establishing that kind of orientation. I can't really say I saw a difference in the roles of men and women in the Pan-African movement that I was involved in, the Pan-African activities that I was involved in. The distinction, the difference, though, is that there was, you had to be very careful, and you had to really take a very strong position to not be exploited, because that did go on. The men would try to take sexual advantage of the women, so you had to be very clear. But once you were clear, once you set the boundaries, like these are the boundaries and you may not cross them, then there wasn't a problem. But if you didn't establish those boundaries, it was going to be an issue.
You said there were things that you were engaged in that may or may not have been on the right side of the fence.
Right.
Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, you know, a piece of the Pan-African movement was about revolution, and it was about establishing our own space. You know, we had sort of moved away from, we're going to go back to Africa. And we kind of moved into a space of, we are African people, and we have a right to be here. And we have to establish our own presence, however we have to do it. You know, and so it was really about thinking about and talking about, if we have to do this by means of a revolution, then that's what we have to do, and then we have to prepare accordingly. There were a couple of kids that, I think there was this one girl that we ran away together, but I don't really call her friend.
Yeah, they would have to leave the white community if they were going to show any solidarity with black folks.
Yeah, it was, I would have to say that I was probably the exception.
Yeah, okay.
There were in my circle of friends, there were people that did form very strong alliances. I did not. I mean, there were some people that we had a relationship, you know, we talked, we may ride to school together, that kind of thing, but I really wasn't. I was very angry.
You mentioned Malcolm X being, how influential was he? And by the time you went to college, of course, he'd already been martyred.
I read his autobiography in high school.
Was it a book that you were allowed to read, or did you have to kind of go and get it on your own?
Well, you know, I just read everything. I don't remember. I mean, I don't think it was, of course it wasn't part of our high school curriculum.
That's what.
No, but this was a book that I read just to read, you know. And during that time, I read a lot of, I actively sought out books by black authors, you know. I read everything I could put my hands on by James Baldwin. You know, I read Malcolm. I mean, you know, it was just like whatever I could find is what I read, you know. So they weren't teaching it in school, so I was reading it on my own. And I think when I initially read it, it took me some time to appreciate it, or appreciate him. I think when I first read it, it was like a reformed pimp, you know. It was like that's kind of how it hit me. You know, it didn't really, I wasn't really knowledgeable of the Nation of Islam. I wasn't curious about it. My head was just in other places. And what you heard from Malcolm, later I heard his speeches, but it was like after he died. But his speeches really didn't resonate in the book. You know, the book was just strictly an autobiography. So I think my appreciation, so to answer the question, did he have an influence? I can't really say. Maybe, maybe not. But you had a question.
Oh, I have a few questions.
Probably. I would say, yeah.
Can you answer that again? Include his question in your answer, please.
Were there a lot of Muslims involved in the Pan-African movement? I would say the answer to that is yes. They weren't Muslims at the time. Or I wasn't aware of them being Muslims at the time. There were kind of two sets of Muslims. I was in Greensboro, North Carolina. There were kind of two sets of Muslims in the city. And then kind of the Pan-Africanists kind of borrowed a little bit of this and a little bit of that from everybody, including borrowing from Islam. You know, not knowing Islam, I wasn't aware of that at the time. But there was the Malcolm X Center, and where you had the Hanafi group, and then you had the Brothers from the Nation. And so there wasn't anything like in the middle. It was just kind of those two groups.
But the Pan-Africanist community was very conciliatory towards Islam and Muslims.
Yes, yes.
At that time. So when did you meet your first Muslim?
my freshman year in the dorm. Yeah, they came to the dorm.
Days. Who was the day?
These brothers from the Malcolm Center. And they kind of came with the same kind of behaviors that you had to deal with the brothers from the Pan-African group. And I just really was not going to play those games. You know, I'm just like not going to go there with you. You know, I came downstairs and I probably had on a pair of shorts and who knows, whatever you wore at that time. And, oh, sister, what you got on? You know, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that. I'm like, okay, good. I'm out of here. So that was my introduction to Islam. You know, that it was like really not good. You know, because I left the church. I made a purposeful decision to leave the church long before I left the church. And, you know, like I was only in the church because I was in my mother's house and was really old before I joined the church, but had to do it because I knew I had to do it before I left. So I waited until the year before I left. I joined the church. I joined a different church
Than your parents?
than my parents' church, which, you know, anyway, my parents' church. And then I left. So, like, now you want me to go to a mosque? Really? So I think that I didn't have an understanding. Because my church experience was not a good one, I never developed a sense of spirituality. My approach to the church, which was the same as my approach to everything in that part of my life, was really very intellectual. So, you know, I was very familiar with the Bible, because just like anything with print, if it's laying around, I'm going to read it. So, you know, I read it. I had some issues with some things that were in it. And then I also had issues with the contradiction between what came from the pulpit and what, you know, the pastor would say, well, according to, and I'm like, that's not what it says. That's not even the tone, you know, of what it says. So, you know, had some issues with that. And then I had some issues with the behavior of how people were treated, you know, all of those things. So here comes somebody who's, first of all, I'm not really going to say on camera how I characterized them, but they were kind of doing some of the same things that the Pan-African brothers were doing with the same, my interpretation was with the same goal in mind. And they wanted me to go to a mosque. What's the difference between a mosque and a church? I'm just not going to do that. Because I had not internalized or developed an understanding of the difference between church, religion, spirituality, God consciousness. God consciousness had not even entered my sphere of being, you know, and I was by then 17 years old, and I still didn't have an understanding of what that meant conceptually.
Were these brothers trying to find wives? Because I've talked to sisters where, you know, they were in college and they knew the Muslim men because they'd be out there in the you know, the thobe and so on, and they'd be vending and they'd be basically trying to find a wife. Is that?
I'm not sure if they were trying to find wives, but they were definitely trying to access one of the privileges of marriage.
I like what you said. So this wasn't you weren't impressed with this group. So you think about Islam as something that was
Oh God, that was years to come.
a viable option.
It was really years to come. I went to, there was this brother that would come around all the time from the Nation of Islam. And, you know, he was kind and polite, and he was respectful. And he was always trying to get me to go to the temple. You know, to me, same thing. Temple, church, synagogue, mosque.
No, was this in North Carolina?
This was in North Carolina. His name was James, Brother James X. And he would just come around and we would just kind of talk. So I ended up going to the temple not because I was seeking religion or Islam or the nation. I ended up going because I needed to step out of the space that I was in. I had stepped into a very dangerous space, and I had been in that space for a while. And so I really came to a very clear understanding that I can't stay in this space anymore. So I decided to step into another space. So the space that I stepped into was the Nation of Islam. I called the brother, I said, is that offer to go to the temple, is that still on? It's still on. So we went to the temple, they said, whatever they say. I mean, I can't even tell you what it is they say to you. I don't even know what they talked about. It was in Winston-Salem. The brother said, I said, yes. And then he said, okay, write this letter. So, I wrote the letter, and then you have to write the letter a whole bunch of times. You just copy this letter, and it's like, okay, now you're part of the Nation of Islam. Of course, my whole family went ballistic, not because they didn't have a problem with Islam. They had a problem with the nation, And it wasn't until, so I was part of the nation, that was in 1972, one or two. And then I was part of that community and learned very early on, don't ask questions. Don't ask questions and don't talk too much. So I didn't. I stopped, because I had lots and lots of questions. And then I came to Atlanta after I graduated from school and went to the temple on Bankhead.
Temple number 15.
Number 15. And I had a degree. And so the captain, Sister Sophia, took me to the minister's office, Minister Rahman. Minister Rahman talked to me about my degree, where'd you go to school, why'd you study psychology, boom, boom, boom. And I was in the classroom the next day teaching social studies. Now, that's a very long story in terms of my connection to the school, and I think it's something that's worth preserving in terms of how we established the school that's now on Fayetteville Road. But I know we're not going to have time for that. To answer your question in terms of when did I get to Islam, I got to Islam with Imam Muhammad. I was, by the time Elijah Muhammad died, I had gone back to graduate school. I was pulled because I came in immediately and started working at the school. And then I also started working with Sister Sophia's leadership team. I became a part of her leadership team. I worked security. I did anything I could to stay out of the lecture because I couldn't reconcile some of the things that were being presented. And so I think it had sort of reached a critical juncture for me by 1974, 75. And I wasn't really, I was challenged with continuing, but I think I was more afraid of stepping away, because I had a cousin who stepped away, and I witnessed the isolation that she experienced, and the loss that she experienced. And so I didn't know if I was prepared for that loss. I was married, I had a child, I had relationships. So I wasn't really sure how or what to do. And then Elijah Muhammad died. And Imam Muhammad came on and said, and mashallah, it was like a breath of fresh air. I was like, oh my God. Because I read the Quran. That was the other piece. I'm a reader.
When did you start reading the Quran?
When they gave it to me. And let me tell you.
That's right after you joined almost.
Yeah, that was when I joined. They gave me a Quran, and I started reading it. And I read in there that you should read a juz every day. Now, it actually said every day during Ramadan. Mm-hmm. Okay, but I didn't get that. Somehow, conceptually, I missed that altogether. So, and I didn't know what a juz was. So I thought you had to read a chapter every day. So every day I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I would read a chapter. I think I had to break up. I had to break up the second surah because you're just like so long. But I would struggle through and I would read a chapter every day. And I have been doing this for years. Because that's what it said do. And I found it intriguing. I just loved reading it. And so,
Do you remember which translation it was?
it was Yusuf Ali.
Yusuf Ali.
I still have that Quran. It's about this thick, and all of the binding on the back has fallen. And so you can literally, if you turn the page comes out in your hand. It's really on this really thin paper. And of course I read all the commentary. I read everything that was in there. And read, because my understanding was that when you read it and you see a little footnote, you read the footnote because that's what you do. But so when Imam Muhammad came on the set, now it was making sense. It made sense to me. And so it was at that point that I think I really found Islam. I really understood Islam. I always, the simplicity of it really was something that, even with the Nation of Islam, something that I got early on. I remember this was after I had joined the Nation of Islam, and I was working security, and there was this big convention, and I think it was here in Atlanta maybe, and she was my middle school guidance counselor also, Mrs. Stafford came and she found me. She heard I was in the Nation and she found me because I was one of her sheep that had gone astray. So she had come to find me and get me out of this cult. And so we stood there on the floor and had this long conversation about one God, Allah, the oneness of Allah, and the Trinity. I really couldn't reconcile the Trinity, so we kept going. She was like, how could you not believe in the Trinity? I'm like, are you crazy? How can you believe in it? It doesn't make any sense. So she kept trying to explain it to me. But I found the whole oneness, that was just so pure and simple to me. It was just, you didn't have to remember all of these other things or think about all these other things. Or even, I don't know, just the whole Jesus thing. The church was just too confusing. It was too much. Islam made so much sense. It was just so logical and just clear and simple, and so for me, if there is God, it's got to be this. It can't be this over here, because as human beings, we always complicate things. When you look at nature is simple and it's straightforward. So this has to be the natural order over here. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but that's how I finally got to Islam.
Yeah, we have so many follow-up questions. Brother Spencer, did you?
Quickly,
Yes.
you said even though you,
Yeah.
what were you struggling with? And I think you touched on why you stayed in isolation, but what was going on? Like, do you feel like after?
I can, some of it, I think there were a couple of things. One was some of the teachings I found uncomfortable. The whole notion of Farad Muhammad was very confusing for me. It was something I really just tried to stay away from and not even have a conversation about, because if I thought about it too much, I would bolt. But then there was a particular incident that really almost took me over the edge. That's what took me out of the lecture. I never went to another lecture after that incident. It was on Bankhead Highway, and an artist, Joe Tex, had converted to Islam, and his name at that particular time was Yusuf something. And so he was giving a lecture, and the habit at that time was big name people they were like instant scholars. I'm not sure how that happened, but I guess because they were celebrities, they would draw a crowd, and so he was giving a lecture, and so he started talking about, he kind of got into this this preacher thing, this kind of rhythm that they get into, and he was like, I know who God is. First he said that Elijah Muhammad was closer to God than his jugular vein. So now God has a jugular vein. So that was setting up the discomfort for me. And then he went on to say, you want to know who God is? You want to know who God is? And then he held up a newspaper, a Muhammad Speaks, and he said, this is God. I got up, I left the temple, I never went back other than to escort somebody in or out. Because even though in my own kind of spiritual development, I hadn't yet gotten to a sophistication of what God was, but I was very clear about what God wasn't. You see what I'm saying? And that was just like, okay, all right, So that was my discomfort. And then again, because I was part of security, I was a lieutenant, I worked at the school, I was privy to a lot of things that went on behind the scenes, and people that came from other places and the conversations and the things that people would do. And so just some of the same hypocrisy that I saw in it was run like a paramilitary organization. We were trained in martial arts. I mean, I don't really know what kind, or brand or anything like that. But, we were trained to defend ourselves. We had a lot of drills. Drilling was very important. Discipline was very important. And I think that was one of the things that I did appreciate about the Nation of Islam, because the first few years, I probably had a better appreciation of it than the last few years that I was a part of it, even though it was only like 3 or 4 years, but maybe the first couple of years, because I was really kind of in a space where I needed to get even. I had gone all the way here. I needed to go all the way here in order to get here. So, like I'm like all the way over here, and I'm just trying to get to a center. And so the Nation of Islam was like a good place to do that. You're on lockdown.
You got rules.
You got rules. You can't go out at night. You got to do what people say. You got to follow. And I needed that.
Really relate to
I
that.
really needed that for where I was, because it just wasn't where I was at the time had a very low probability for a good outcome. Even though I was an honor student, all that, but yeah.
I'm just relating because that's my story.
Yeah,
That's all I'm
it was
saying.
not going to be pretty, but eventually that's where it was going to go. And and unfortunately, some of the people that I went to school with, that's where it went. Who were part of that circle. It was a very sophisticated, very intelligent, and very dangerous circle.
A lot of intelligence, not a lot of wisdom.
No wisdom.
Yeah.
No wisdom at
We're
all.
going to continue.
Yeah, to be
Yes, Tito's not here yet, so we're good.
Oh, really? Well, no, she has to take her granddaughter to
Can we have time for maybe one or
Closing
two more
question.
questions? Or
Maybe one. We're
more
really
question?
late. Yeah.
Okay, so how do we want to wrap this up? Because my main question right now is how the community handled the transition to Islam, after 1975. But I
Can
know
I
that's
ask-
probably another discussion, right?
That's a
Yeah.
long. We prayed. It was a process in terms of our leadership, how the leadership changed, and and I have to, Imam Muhammad handled it, I think, in a very appropriate way, in that he just sort of chipped away at some of these institutions just a little bit at a time, to allow people to get adjusted. And so there were some places where, he would take away this thing, but then replace it with this, and then eventually take that away. So, it was a very, very gradual process, but it was very difficult for people. It was very difficult for a lot of people. Some, violence was involved in some cases. Here in Atlanta, we had to call the police, clear out the building, the whole 9 yards. We lost an entire generation, I believe. Yeah.
All right.
Did you know Sister B?
Yes.
Can you just briefly, if you want to share something about her with us?
Sister B was such a delight. She was the epitome of spirit and energy and love. She never met a stranger. And I never saw Sister B with any negative energy about her. Even if she was upset about something, she never complained. She was just a lovely, lovely spirit. I've been working with the fashion show since I came back. I moved away and then I came back in 94. And I started working with a fashion show then, and Sister B was very much a part of that for many, many years. So, she was just a joy.
Well, alhamdulillah, thank you so much.
I'm looking forward to the next interview.
And prayer time comes in, how do you, what do? You don't have any place to go and pray, and boom, boom, boom. And he said, well, you can pray in your chair. And I said, well, what if that's distracting? That's kind of. And so he said, well, you can pray in your mind. He said,
But see, and the sheikh was basically saying, if you can't get it in any other
way, yeah. But I
brother
think
could just run
right,
with it and be
right,
like,
right.
"Oh, well,
And so
you could just pray in your
and he
mind."
probably even said that, and he said you can see. He said you sit very, very still, and then you see in your mind you going through the positions of prayer. And so that's where that person got stuck.
Was that the Nigerian chef?
That was a Nigerian sheikh.
Okay.
You remember him?